Forget the rumors you've been hearing online. The real economic war between the US and Canada is happening right now, and it's far more shocking than you think. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how a series of crippling tariffs and a high-stakes Supreme Court showdown pushed two of the world's closest allies to the brink, and what it all means for your wallet. This isn't just another trade spat. It's a fundamental rupture in the relationship, a conflict that has moved from the negotiating table to the highest court in the land. And the fallout is just beginning. Section 1. The Problem. An unprecedented opening salvo. It all ignited on February 1, 2025. On that day, the White House signed orders that would set the North American economy on fire, announcing its plan to impose massive new tariffs on Canada. The stated reasons were a mix of national security and a supposed crisis involving fentanyl trafficking, a justification many experts immediately questioned. But the reasons mattered less than the reality. On March 4, 2025, the hammer fell. A punishing 25% tariff was slapped on a huge range of Canadian goods entering the United States, with a 10% tariff on Canadian energy. To get the scale of this, you have to understand that the US and Canada have one of the most integrated trading relationships on the planet. Billions of dollars in goods cross that border every single day. This wasn't a surgical strike on one or two industries. This felt like a near-universal economic blockade against America's oldest and most reliable partner. For decades, the US-Canada relationship was the textbook example of cooperation. Their supply chains, especially in sectors like auto manufacturing, were so deeply intertwined that parts could cross the border multiple times before a car was finished. These tariffs didn't just target Canadian companies, they targeted that very integration. The move sent shockwaves through the global economy. If the United States was willing to do this to Canada, who was safe? The problem was Washington had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. They expected Canada to just fold. They were wrong. Canada's response wasn't one of surrender. It was one of calculated retaliation. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government made it clear that Canada would not be bullied. The counterattack was immediate. As the US tariffs went live on March 4th, Canada unleashed its own. A 25% surtax was imposed on $30 billion worth of iconic American products. Suddenly, things like American-made peanut butter, orange juice, and coffee got a lot more expensive on Canadian shelves. This wasn't a random list. It was surgically designed to inflict maximum political pain by targeting goods produced in key states and districts across the U.S. This wasn't just a government action. It tapped into a deep well of national pride. A powerful "Buy Canadian" sentiment swept the nation, as Canadians, feeling unfairly targeted, began consciously avoiding American goods and canceling travel plans to the U.S. It was a grassroots economic rebellion. The pain was starting to boomerang back across the border. In a move to de-escalate, Canada would later drop this initial wave of retaliatory tariffs on September 1, 2025, but kept others in place on key sectors like steel and autos. Here's the fundamental truth about tariffs that gets lost in the political noise. The country imposing the tariff doesn't make the other country pay for it. The cost is paid by its own importers, who then pass that cost down to consumers. When a U.S. company imports Canadian goods, the U.S. government adds its tax at the border. That company then has a choice: absorb the cost and make less profit, or raise the price on the shelf. Inevitably, you and I pay for it. And that's exactly what started happening. These tariffs became a direct tax on American households. A study by congressional Democrats estimated the tariffs cost the average American household $1,745 in 2025 alone, with projections showing that cost would soar to over $2,500 in 2026. The pain wasn't spread evenly. U.S. industries that rely on Canadian materials saw their costs skyrocket. The deeply integrated auto industry was thrown into chaos. This cloud of uncertainty settled over the entire economy as businesses on both sides of the border, unable to plan for the future, slammed the brakes on investment and hiring. The trade war, launched to supposedly protect American interests, was now actively hurting American workers and consumers. It was a self-inflicted wound. And just as the economic pain was becoming undeniable, the entire legal foundation for the war was about to be blown apart. This is where the story turns from a trade war into a constitutional crisis. To impose these sweeping tariffs, the White House had used a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. But a coalition of businesses filed a lawsuit, Learning Resources Inc. v. Trump, arguing that the president had illegally taken a power the Constitution explicitly gives to Congress, the power to levy taxes and tariffs. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the court sided with the administration, it would grant the executive branch vast, unchecked power to tax the American people. If it sided with the importers, the administration's entire trade policy would be rendered illegal. On February 20, 2026, the decision came down. In a landmark 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the IEEPA does not grant the president the authority to impose tariffs. The court's reasoning was a direct defense of the separation of powers. The power to tax belongs to Congress, period. The ruling was a legal bombshell. It meant that for the past year, billions of dollars in tariffs, an estimated $175 billion, had been collected illegally from American businesses. The trade war wasn't just damaging. The Supreme Court had just declared it unlawful. The administration had been stunningly defeated, not by a foreign power, but by its own judicial system. The war, however, was far from over. It was about to get even stranger. The Supreme Court's decision plunged Washington into chaos. Importers who had paid billions in these now illegal tariffs immediately began demanding refunds, creating a logistical and financial nightmare for the government. But the administration's response wasn't to back down. It was to double down. Within hours of the ruling, the White House announced it was invoking a different, rarely used law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This obscure provision allows the president to impose temporary global tariffs for up to 150 days to address fundamental international payments problems. On February 24, 2026, a new 10% global tariff went into effect. This was a desperate pivot. To avoid another immediate war with its neighbors, the administration exempted CUSMA-compliant goods from Canada and Mexico. But this was just a temporary bridge. To find a more permanent legal justification, the administration simultaneously launched dozens of new investigations under another law, Section 301, targeting countries around the world, including Canada. The message was chilling. The Supreme Court had cut off one head of the Hydra, but the administration was already growing new ones. The economic war was no longer being fought with one big club. It was now a multi-front guerrilla war of legal challenges and bureaucratic investigations, all designed to create a state of permanent uncertainty. While Washington was scrambling for new legal weapons, Canada was fundamentally rewriting its economic playbook. Under Prime Minister Trudeau's leadership, the strategy shifted from simple retaliation to long-term strategic independence. For decades, Canadian policy was built on the foundation of its proximity to the world's largest economy. But the trade shocks made it painfully clear that Canada needed to de-risk and reduce its overwhelming dependence on the American market. This wasn't just talk. Ottawa began aggressively pursuing deeper trade ties with the European Union and partners in Asia, actively working to diversify its economy. This wasn't the sensational dollar ban of online rumors. This was something far more sophisticated and significant. Canada was preparing for a future where the U.S. could no longer be trusted as a stable and predictable partner. It was building an economic firewall, insulating its future from American political pressure. So where does this leave us? The United States launched an unprecedented economic war, believing its closest ally would surrender. Instead, Canada fought back with a strategic response that hurt the U.S. economy. Then, the entire legal premise of the American strategy was struck down by its own Supreme Court, forcing the administration into a chaotic new phase of the conflict. The U.S.-Canada trade war didn't just go nuclear, it went to the very heart of the constitutional and economic order. The real shock isn't about online rumors. It's that the longest undefended border in the world has become a hard economic front line. The trust built over a century has been shattered. And now, Canada is actively building a future where it no longer has to depend on its unpredictable neighbor. With the CUSMA trade deal, the successor to NAFTA, up for a critical review this year, the central question remains: can the US and Canada ever repair this relationship? Or is this bitter, distrustful conflict the new normal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay updated on these global economic events and understand the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more.